the shine come off the idea of democracy in parts of Africa? The continent's latest crop of military leaders seem to be enjoying immense popularity. So are Africans prepared to live under the rule of soldiers? Or is there another way? This is Africa Here and Now. I'm Martine Dennis. Well, these are questions for my guest, Gilles Yabi, who is founder and CEO of the West Africa Citizen think tank. He's in the Senegalese capital, Dakar. And in Johannesburg, MARISA LOURENCO, an independent political analyst. Welcome to you both. Now, we've witnessed what's been called a kind of coup contagion across West Africa and the Sahel in recent times. And the military leaders seem to be revered, idolized, like Captain Traore of Burkina Faso. So have Africans turned their backs on democracy as a mode of governance? Starting with you, Gilles, in Dakar.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and very good to meet Marisa as well. I think the first thing to say is that the fact that you have military coups in some country in West Africa, and even we had one in Gabon in Central Africa, it doesn't mean that Africa as a whole is embracing military coups or military regimes. I think that is very important. Africa is a continent, a wide continent. We do have a regression in terms of democratic construction in many parts of the continent beyond the countries where we had military coups. But I think it's very important to see that we are talking about individual countries, and especially the military coup in West Africa. Most of them happen in the Sahel, in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Three countries which also experience rebellion and terrorist activities. So these military coups happen in the context of severe insecurity. And insecurity was one of the pretexts, actually, that give the feeling for some of the population that the military leaders might be more able to respond to the security situation than civilian leaders. The only coup that happened in West Africa, which doesn't have to do also with the security context, is Guinea. Guinea capital Conakry. This military coup happened in the context of an extension of the mandate of the former president Alpha Condé. So the military leaders was actually someone who was pushed by Alpha Condé, was given a lot of military means, and then he happened to make this coup with the pretext that the former president, even if he was an elected president, was not actually a democratic leader. So there was also a pretext for this military takeover. And maybe the last thing that I would say, which in my opinion is very important, is that we should not make a confusion about the fact that people embrace a military coup because they are happy that the leaders who were in place have been toppled. And to make the confusion that they are supporting military regimes. It's not the same thing. They were happy to some extent because of the failed results of the former elected presidents, but it doesn't mean that most people want military dictatorship for a long time.
And Marisa, I guess Gabon will also fall into that latter category that Gilles mentioned, where it came about as a consequence of a long-standing leader devising events in order to stay in power, or just putting out a fairly phony kind of election. So that was Gabon as well. Now, so the rollback of democratic norms, if you like, is also a major issue, isn't it, in terms of political instability on the continent at the moment?
Yeah, so I think, Gabon is a useful example, just going back to, to what Jill has been saying, that, people are not necessarily in support of military coups, but they fed up with the previous president. And in the case of Gabon, Ali Bongo made a critical mistake because he started to prep his son, Nordine, to start to take over, kind of extending this Bongo dynasty. People had just had enough of that. But I think, it wasn't the people. I think that we also have to be careful not to confuse military coups with popular uprisings. What we're really seeing is, a kind of other elite, this time the military, that is, a very small group of people that is seizing power from the previous, typically long-standing political elite. This is not driven, from the ground up. These are not grassroots political movements. And I think that that's key in understanding what has been going on. I also really like, Jill, when you said when we have to consider, does Africa need democracy or are Africans rejecting democracy? The fact that, Africa is not this monolith. There are many countries with many different dynamics. But I think what unites the Sahel is certainly the insecurity that Jill pointed out, but definitely the fact that these military figures are able to take over, which is not necessarily something new for that for that part of that region. I think if you look at Mauritania, which is actually kind of the beacon of stability at the moment in the Sahel, but it has this also long history of instability and coups, but really these military strongmen. And we're kind of seeing a continuation of that. I think it's also important to note that democracy was never really entrenched in these countries. So it's not necessarily that people are rejecting democracy, they're rejecting the status quo. And then we're seeing this disinformation creep in, where these military leaders are then supported by outside forces to say, well, no, this is actually what the people want. And then, pointing to real issues, for example, the fact that the post-colonial era has not really delivered equality like we expected it to, and then using that to say, well, no, it's a failure of democracy. And it's not a failure of democracy. It's a failure to change African economies from being purely extractive. We're kind of sitting in a continuation of the post-colonial era. And I think that with all of the challenges and socioeconomic difficulties that raises, that's what leads to this popular frustration that we're seeing that is now being exploited by military strongmen.
All right, but going back to the other point that I raised, and that is that there are many governments that are speaking the language of democracy, but are actually not putting it into practice, and it's being tolerated. Western powers are looking away. The institutions like ECOWAS, for instance, are certainly not making a fuss about very dodgy elections that are held, and also systems in place that are eroding rights and political freedoms.
Yes, and I think what one of the big problems has been is and I think what these coups across the Sahel have really revealed is, to be honest, kind of how useless a lot of these regional bodies are. You mentioned ECOWAS, but we have the same problem here, with the Southern African Development Community. When Zimbabwe had massive post-election violence in, the early 2000s, and then there was a lot of land expropriation there, which also resulted with a lot of refugees spilling into South Africa. Much more recently, we had a post-election crisis in Mozambique. It really just reveals that these kinds of organizations, they can't go above and beyond, the sovereignty of these countries. But what we also find is that sometimes the leaders of these countries don't really want to challenge their neighbors. They don't want to sort of call out on leadership, because then they're sometimes in the same case doing the same things as their counterparts, as their neighbors. And of course, the West, I think, is going to look away. I mean, like I said before, the post-colonial Africa is still made up of extractive economies. These benefit the West, but of course they benefit other foreign powers. I mean, China's a big one as well. So they're not really going to get involved.
All right. So what I'm hearing from both of you is that this is not a rejection outright of democratic values. But there is a groundswell of opinion that I'm hearing left, right and centre, particularly when it comes to the subject of Captain Traore of Burkina Faso and other military leaders, and that is a rejection of what is described as Western values and democracy.
Yeah, it is very complex issues, and I think there are many points to be mentioned. The first is that we should not make a confusion between democratic values and Western values. Again, democracy is a construction. It is everywhere a construction. It is not something which is a given. The West has been marked by a number of authoritarian regimes. You had a lot of kingdoms. You still actually have a mix of constitutional democracy where you still have king. I think the political institutions are always something which is constructed by the people over decades, over centuries, in the case of Europe, for example. And I think it is very important not to make this confusion between Western values as if democracy was consubstantial to the West. I don't think that that can be proven. And we have democratic institutions in other part of the world, in India and even in Africa, pre-colonial Africa. You can see some form of government where you have a need for consultation, where you do have equivalent of check and balances. So I think it's very important to not to make this confusion, because it actually encourages the number of people who just don't want democratic values. For me, democracy is not election. For me, the basics is very simple. It is the fact that you have a link, you have a connection between those who govern and those who are governed. That is the basic. And then we can decide about the precise political institution that we put in place. And these political institutions are always encoded into the various countries and societies. And they are never, again, fixed. You can decide to change your political institutions. The other thing that I want to say is that when we talk about rejection of democracy, actually, when we look at the surveys by Afrobarometer, which is one of the most credible research institute doing surveys across the continent. They published last year reports showing very clearly that you still have, I think, 66% of Africans, basically in all the countries that was surveyed in average, of course, who supports democracy as the best form of government. When you look at individual countries, you can see the evolution in the next, in the last decade. And yes, the evolution is not positive. You have less support, but the support is still massive, actually, for democratic form of government. And one thing which is very clear from all the surveys from Afrobarometer is that there is a difference between the support for democracy as the best form of government by these principles and the fact that people consider that they are living in a country which is democratic. Most of the people don't think that they are living in countries that are actually fully fledged functioning democracies. So there is a difference to be made between the support for democracy as a system, theoretical system of government, and the fact that people are not happy with the way their country are being governed.
And Marisa, I'm particularly interested in your region, in the SADC region, where, of course, many of the governments have come through as a result of a struggle, an armed struggle in many instances. And so, therefore, you've got the parties of liberation in power still. Many of those are seeing quite a backlash, aren't they? Many of them, I mean, Frelimo had a very, very awkward time in the last election. As we know, the ANC lost its overall majority. So the parties of liberation, they're facing now a bit of a backlash. Is there a distinction, therefore, between those kinds of governments that have come from liberation movements and others on the continent?
Not necessarily. I think what makes Southern Africa as a sub-region unique at this particular point in time is the fact that, as you've pointed out, many of the countries in the sub-region still do have the former liberation movement turned ruling party in power. So yes, the ANC lost its majority, but it's still the largest party in the country. ZANU-PF and Frelimo still keep going, even though they completely lack popular support, but they have an iron, they run these countries with an iron fist. We see SWAPO in Namibia, and we see the MPLA in Angola that are declining in popularity, and are very, very worried about that. But I think what is making these former liberation movements nervous is that if you look at the rest of the continent, we don't have, in many cases, or in most cases, the former liberation movements still in power. Their time has come and gone. I think why they are still sort of hanging on in Southern Africa is that if you compare it to the rest of the continent, independence from colonial powers came to this region a lot later than the rest of the continent. Some of them were also afflicted by civil wars. Namibia, of course, had interference from apartheid South Africa. So the dynamics in the sub-region have been different to the rest of the continent, but it doesn't make them immune from it. So it might be reaching us a little bit later, but it's still going to come. And I think it's quite a normal evolution. I think it's partly driven by younger populations that are rejecting older liberation movements. And again, there's a general dissatisfaction with very high inequality, especially in South Africa, Angola, and Namibia.
And many populations, I think, could justifiably say that democracy in all its flaws has not really yielded much of a dividend for many people in various African countries. So it's quite understandable if they say that democracy doesn't actually work for them. Would you say that that's something you'd agree with, Gilles?
Well, no, I think, first of all, and that is also an important point in the debate about democracy. I think democracy is not initially about having, producing economic growth or even economic development or social development. Democracy has, by its principle itself, is something that some people think that it is good for society, irrespective of what it means in terms of supporting or not economic development. Democracy is, first of all, again, a system of government where you have this connection with accountability between those who govern and those who are governed. And it's also it is distinct from what we call in French état de droit, kind of rule of law. But actually, you will see that democracy has to go with rule of law. It has to go with other set of principles, which are not just about the choice of a majority, for example. It goes with freedoms, with respect for freedom of expression, freedom of media, etc. So I think, first of all, we really need to have a discussion on the continent about, do we think that for our societies, do we think that for countries where you have so many different groups, ethno-linguistic groups, do we think that democratic institutions are the best way to get collect a better future? Or do we think that alternative democracy, and we have to define that, we have to be very clear. If you don't want democracy, we need to agree on what are the alternative, and then we have to discuss it. Yeah.
What about this kind of hybrid systems where you do have a pluralistic political system alongside a traditional system like a house of elders, tribal chiefs? I think Botswana has
Yes,
a
exactly.
working scene like
Many
that,
African
as does
countries
Ghana.
have that though.
Exactly.
They do,
Exactly. And there is that's a very interesting question, because for some people in many debates in Senegal, actually in all the region, all the conferences that I attended, I always get this question about, why should we adopt democracy, which is imported from the West? Why shouldn't we have African system of government? And my response is always, first of all, you have to explain to me what are the key pillars in the democratic system that are not compatible with African culture or societies. And then I got no responses, no clear responses about what is the problem fundamentally, what is the incompatibility between democratic norms and African societies or African cultures. Secondly, I used to mention that, Botswana is one of the most stable democracy in the continent. But initially, in the first constitution of Botswana, you have element from the parliamentary system of the UK, and then you have the inclusion of the House of Chiefs, traditional power structures that were included. In Ghana, you have the same system. So it's our choice to be innovative and to be able to have more sophisticated system of government where you have democratic pillars, but you also have some elements that are actually linked to the traditional forms of power that we have. But my point is also that when we think about institutions, we should be thinking about the future. We should be thinking about what kind of institutions we want for our kids. That's the issue. It's not going back to the past. Is trying to imagine the kind of political institution that we just make life better for the next generation on the continent. And that means elements of modernity, how we call it. It means also recognizing the failures and the problems with the current modern democratic systems, because we have a lot of problem with elections, a lot of problem with disinformation, a lot of problem with artificial intelligence, a lot of problem with the lack of control of the funding of political activities. So we need to address all these elements to make our democratic system credible and to increase the chances for the democratic system to produce the result that we want for the people.
Marisa, you made an interesting connection between the extractive nature of most African economies and the political instability that many countries have been experiencing of late. Does it necessarily, therefore, require there to be more advancement in terms of the economies of these countries in order to ground a more stable political landscape? Or I mean, what comes first? A better economy, a more rounded, a more developed economy, or a political system that is pluralistic and inclusive and fair?
I mean, yeah, that's the classic development or democracy debate. And, I remember when when I first came across this, when I first went to university, I thought, well, does democracy really matter if you've got development, you've got, transport infrastructure going, people have access to economic opportunities. And then I came across a really good argument, and I really wish I could remember which academic it was. Unfortunately, I can't. It was a long time ago. But they made the argument that, if you have development before democracy, you don't really get to embed like these good institutions. You don't really get a certain rule of law that you want. So you can't just transplant it later after you've had this kind of development. And without protecting human rights, they need to grow hand in hand. And I don't think that democracy stifles development. I think a lot of the time it's weaponized by certain regimes. And I think that's exactly what's going on now in certain parts of the continent. So if you look at Burkina Faso and, the famous Ibrahim Traore, which, I mean, it drives me mad how much support he gets online because of the amount of disinformation that's there. But instead of looking at the root causes, people are just saying, oh, well, it's democracy, so that they can try to drum up popular support for him. And then, once you've got enough popular support, you start to limit the potential of a popular uprising against him. Maybe you can stop making fake news and actually take real videos of people supporting him. But I don't think that that's fair or accurate. I think that, development and democracy are not, on opposite sides. I think that they can coexist. If you start pushing development, but you don't have a vision or a future or the betterment of society at hand, then what's the development for at the end of the day?
And we've mentioned in passing, haven't we, the involvement of outside powers, and obviously there are the biggest investors are the Chinese, of course. The Russians are having a resurgence, aren't they, in these countries where the Western countries have been unceremoniously kicked out in some instances. And also the Gulf countries have been highlighted as playing not necessarily a positive role in many of the countries. I'm thinking of Sudan and the UAE, and in fact the rest of the Horn of Africa. So what do you think? How do you think outside forces should be controlled or contained in terms of their input on the continent?
Again, I think that we should make a distinction between different issues, and the issue of the external influence on the continent is not something new, and it has to do with geopolitics. It has to do with the interest of big powers, but actually not only the big powers. You also have middle powers emerging. You have a lot of countries who, after having made some progress internally, are able to project themselves externally, to have markets, but also to have access to natural resources, including, of course, in Africa. And I think that, again, it's not only China or Russia or the Gulf countries. It also has been the case of the Western countries as well. We should be very clear about that. So for me, there is a distinction between the issue of building democratic system, which is very important, but which is not enough, in my opinion. We also need to build strong states. There is, in my opinion, a difference between building strong democracies and building strong states. A country like China is not a democratic country, but it is a strong state. And actually, it is useful to have a strong state, even if you don't have a democratic system, because the strong state means having the capacity to implement policies, having a capacity also to have some security, and then maybe to control also the perimeter of external influences. So I really think that, again, democracy only cannot actually be enough for African countries to be able, for example, to confront external influences and to be able to find their way in a world which is extremely competitive. And then we need also strong economies. And I think strong states, strong economies, strong political institutions that are democratic, the problem and the challenges that we have in the continent that we have to do, the free at the same time. It was not the case for most of the countries in over continent. In Europe or even in the US, I think some of the pillars for the economic prosperity were put in place while the system were not actually democratic system. So they have the capacity to accumulate capital and maybe to build infrastructure and exploiting, for example, the slaves, but also exploiting actually the poor people for some time. But we have to do the free at the same time, and that is extremely difficult.
Marisa, so Africa is starting from a very low starting point, right? On so many metrics. What needs to happen next? Given that you both agreed that democracy is to be aspired to, is not necessarily a foreign construct that's being foisted on the continent. What needs to happen next?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily think that Africa is starting from a lower starting point. I think it's from a different starting point. So, Gilles has been explaining how certain countries have developed and how they have, grown their economies and become strong states. African countries are not going to follow that same path because our history has been extraordinarily different and it's had a lot of interference, and that interference continues to this day. But I think what is so important, and I think this, and I mean, again, I'm always careful to not refer to Africa as a monolith, but I think this is broadly applicable for the continent. But I think to not always look to the outside for solutions, and to also to take some accountability for the mess that we find ourselves in. So I think, when this debate comes up of does Africa need democracy, and, you mentioned at the beginning, it's been called, a Western concept. I mean, as you pointed out, that's not necessarily the case. It's not something at odds with, African values. But I think that when we listen to these arguments that say, is it a Western system that's imposed from the outside, we're also absolving ourselves from some kind of responsibility for how post-colonial Africa looks. I think it's very difficult for African economies to not be extractive economies. They were that way for hundreds of years. You're not going to uproot that in less than 100 years. But I don't see the African leaders that came in right after independence. There has not been a real effort to actually change that. So, for example, if you look at the mining industry, which is important for many, many African economies, we've just had the DRC recently that has continued the ban on exports of cobalt. That is, it's a short-term fix. They're trying to push the price back up because there's an oversupply in the global market and the price is very low, and they rely on that for a lot of revenue. That's not the answer. The answer is building a local processing plant. It's beneficiation. And this doesn't just go for the DRC. It goes for many, many other African countries. If we can start to change how economies are structured, they are likely to still be dependent on, commodities like either from mining or from oil or gas. And that's fine. There's a lot of value there. These are minerals that the entire world needs, especially for technology. But we've got to find a different way to how we use them. And again, saying, one foreign power is negative and one is, better than the other. So at the moment, especially in the Sahel, it's, anti-France, which I think is valid on many fronts. But France is not the whole problem, and having Russia there is not going to be the solution. The solution is to take accountability. It's to uproot these political elites that just replace the colonial elites. And it's to have a really serious hard look and say, what does the long-term development trajectory look like? Unfortunately, that goes beyond, 5 terms in power, even 30 terms in power. If you look at some African leaders that just refuse to leave or win every election. But that's really the kind of discussion that needs to take place. So I think we need to start stop looking at the outside and saying, this is, not our fault at all, and saying, okay, well, what can we actually do? We have a different development trajectory. That's absolutely fine. But where do we take responsibility, and how do we create the future that we want?
Well, that brings us neatly, doesn't it, to the issue of leadership. And Gilles, I mean, we can use Rwanda as a perfect example of perhaps less than perfect democratic values in terms of the way the country is governed, but Paul Kagame himself is fated by so many on account of the socioeconomic development that his country has enjoyed and benefited from. So is that the way forward? I mean, for instance, our term limits actually, do they hinder progress in terms of a legislative agenda?
No, I think it's good that you bring the example of Rwanda. I think the first thing is that there is a difference to make between the communication about the exceptional socioeconomic results of Rwanda under Paul Kagame and the reality. The reality is more nuanced. There are some studies about the level of poverty in Rwanda is still very high. So the results, there have been some progress for very clearly some spectacular changes in Kigali, but again, there is also a lot of effort in communication and great communication by Rwanda. But the reality is again more mixed, and actually the support of external funders was also extremely important in Rwanda after the genocide, but also in support of Paul Kagame for a long time. You still have a lot of the budget which is actually funded by external powers. And then, but we have to recognize that, yes, there is certainly a better governance system, some system of evaluation, for example, of the various member of government in Rwanda, and some public policies that are quite good. And I think that leads me to a point which I think we should be very honest in the debate about democracy, in saying that in the short term, there is no guarantee that a democratic system necessarily produce the best results in terms of economic growth, especially. Just because democratic system means debate, it means deliberation, it means more discussion. So of course it is slow. It will be slower than having a good leader, making a decision quickly, and then, without a lot of discussion, it just decide and things are done. But even the good leaders initially generally actually get old, and to some extent, generally also get less and less efficient. And I think even with Kagame, we can see that at one point, if you don't consolidate the political institutions so that there is a clear succession in the political power, then actually, the more you stay, the more you increase the risk that all the success that have been registered will be lost. But again, we should recognize that we have a conflict between the short mandate, 5-year term, 4-year term, for example, in Nigeria or Ghana, for a president. Of course, if you want to be reelected very quickly, you will have more interest for things that can get the attention of the voters, and not necessarily the best choices for the country in the long run. So we should recognize these failures, and I think that's one of the reasons why in the think tank that I run, WATHI, we try to think about institutions that can be devoted to long-term issues while retaining democratic system to have this alternation of power. And I think we can work in this direction.
And Marisa, who came to mind when Gilles was talking, but Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, of course, because any good that was done by him in his first couple of terms was completely overturned, wasn't it? Really, by staying too long and then allowing the party to become really the state. The party ZANU-PF has become the state, or sees itself as the state, and that's where the mistake was made.
Yeah, I think really what happened with Mugabe is that he found himself losing power within the party itself, but even worse for him, with the military. And obviously the military is very, very powerful. And so, what he did was he went for a short-term snap solution, which was to seize land. And then, he disguised it in this kind of, anti-imperialism, post-colonial move that, was all about the people. But really it was about seizing privately owned land and giving it to army generals for their loyalty. And then, of course, eventually, less than 15 years later, it wouldn't work out for him, and he'd eventually be cast out. But this is, Zimbabwe is not the only example of where the party is the state. I mean, its neighbor Mozambique is another clear example of that. Frelimo has just kept entrenching power, taking over institutions, and now you can't actually separate the two. But just on something where Gilles said about how president, have short terms, and also going back to your other question there, it's interesting because, in South Africa, we don't have a presidential vote. Neither does Botswana, neither does Angola. And in South Africa's case, it was a very clear, deliberate decision because obviously for us to get to be a multi-party democracy was a very long and very hard struggle. And, the idea is that it's actually better if Parliament chooses the president. In Angola's case, there was a presidential vote and that was removed because the MPLA's president was declining in popularity. So it can also be manipulated. But I think what it shows is that there are many ways to kind of overcome some of these things. Not every democracy looks the same, and it can be configured to what might work better for a country. We don't have to take a stock standard example and impose it. We can kind of configure it any way we want to. And I think in Africa, we also have the fortune of looking to see, how have European democracies evolved? We don't have to make those same mistakes. There are so many lessons to be learned. We're coming from very different contexts, but I think it is very helpful to look for that, and we should use that to our advantage.
Thank you very much. I think that ends our conversation on Africa Here and Now. Marisa, thank you so much. It was really good to talk to you. And Gilles, wonderful to meet you. I hope that we can all talk again quite soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's all for this edition of Africa Here and Now. We recorded it on May the 27th, 2025. Please remember to like, subscribe and share. We're trying to seduce the algorithm. We're also available on all the major audio platforms and you can follow us on the socials. I'm at Martine Dennis on X. Get in touch. Our fabulous original music is by Emmerich Adam. Our producer is Anne Busby. Tevin Sudi and Simon Elliott put everything together. My thanks to my guests, Gilles and Marisa. And as ever, my thanks to you for your company.